Hello, everyone. Have you ever woken up and felt like you've lost a piece of the night? Not just from sleep, but like a section of time was surgically removed from your memory. What if that happened to your entire town, all at the exact same second? My name is Leo, or at least, that's the name I use now. The name I was born with is buried back in a small Colorado mountain town called Silver Creek, a place that officially no longer exists, its memory scrubbed clean by bureaucracy and fear. But I was there. I was 17 on the night it happened. October 12th, 2003. It was a Sunday. I remember the mundane details with a clarity that feels almost artificial, as if they were implanted. I was in my room, struggling with a calculus assignment that felt like the most important thing in the world. The scent of pine from the woods behind our house was sharp in the cold autumn air. My dad was asleep in his armchair downstairs, the local news droning on the television. My mom was reading in bed. A perfectly average, forgettable night in a town where nothing ever happened. The last thing I remember checking on my alarm clock was 3:14 a.m. I was frustrated, rubbing my eyes, deciding to give up on the derivatives and just go to sleep. I recall the feeling of my head hitting the pillow, the familiar weight of my comforter. And then, nothing. Not the gentle slide into slumber, but a hard cut. A blink. One moment my eyes were closing at what I thought was 3:14 a.m., and the next, they were snapping open. The first thing I felt was a profound, bone-deep confusion. The quality of the light in my room was wrong. It wasn't the pre-dawn gray I expected, but the soft, pale glow of early morning. My alarm clock read 7:42 a.m. I hadn't just overslept. I had slept through my alarm, which was set for 6:30. That had never happened before. I sat up, a dull throb behind my eyes. The house was silent. Too silent. The usual morning sounds, the coffee maker gurgling, my dad's quiet footsteps, the radio in the kitchen, were all absent. I called out, "Mom! Dad?" No answer. I swung my legs out of bed and felt a strange stiffness in my joints, as if I'd run a marathon in my sleep. Downstairs, the scene was what cemented the first layer of ice in my stomach. The television was still on, but the screen was static snow. My dad was exactly where I'd last seen him, slumped in his armchair. For a terrifying second, I thought the worst. But as I rushed over, his chest was rising and falling. He was just deeply, unnaturally asleep. I shook his shoulder. "Dad! Dad! Wake up!" His eyelids fluttered, then opened. He looked at me, his eyes unfocused, clouded with the same profound confusion I felt. "Leo, what time is it?" he mumbled, his voice thick. "It's almost 8, I said. "You slept in the chair all night." He looked around the room at the static on the TV, at the morning light. "No. I was just watching the end of the news." He trailed off, his brow furrowed. He couldn't reconcile the time. I went to my mom's room. She was also asleep, her book lying open on her chest. Waking her was the same struggle. She woke up with a gasp, disoriented, claiming she'd just closed her eyes for a moment. It was then that we heard it. A single, mournful siren starting up from the direction of the fire station downtown. Then another. And another. Soon, the crisp morning air was filled with a discordant symphony of emergency alarms, a sound we had never heard in the quiet history of Silver Creek. I went to the window and looked out at our street. It was a mirror of our own house. People were emerging from their homes in pajamas and bathrobes, their faces masks of bewilderment. Mr. Henderson from across the street was staring at his car, which was parked halfway on his lawn, its front bumper nestled gently against his prize-winning rose bushes. He was still holding his car keys. The engine was cold. He had no memory of parking it there. Further down, the bakery delivery van was idling in the middle of the road. The driver slumped over the wheel, just beginning to stir. Something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. We hadn't just overslept. We had all been switched off. The initial shared experience was one of groggy disbelief. Neighbors spoke to each other in hushed, confused tones across fences and on sidewalks. The stories were all eerily identical. I was just getting a glass of water. I was letting the dog out. I was turning the page of my book. And then, the blink. A moment of lost time, snapping back into consciousness hours later, in a different position, with a dull headache and a strange metallic taste in the back of the throat. My friend Chloe, who lived 2 blocks away, called my landline, her voice trembling. Her father, a volunteer firefighter, had been one of the first to wake up at the station. He'd been in the middle of a sentence during a late-night card game. When he woke up, he was still sitting at the table, cards in hand, but his friend across from him had fallen forward, his head resting on the pile of chips. The fire chief had been in the bathroom and woke up on the cold tile floor. The town's single police officer on duty, Officer Miller, provided the most chilling piece of the puzzle. He was on patrol. He remembered driving down Main Street, noting the time on his dashboard clock, 3:16 a.m. He was about to make a turn onto Oak Avenue. His next memory was of the patrol car jolting to a stop against the curb in front of the town library, miles from his intended route. The engine was off. The clock read 7:38 a.m. He, like everyone else, had lost over 4 hours. But he had the crucial timestamp, 3:16 a.m. As this information spread through the panicked phone calls and street corner conferences, a collective, chilling realization washed over us. It wasn't just a handful of people. It was everyone. And it was synchronized. My own memory of seeing 3:14 on my clock, deciding to go to sleep, aligned perfectly. It would take a few minutes for my head to hit the pillow, to drift into that initial phase of sleep. 3:17 a.m. That became the number, the temporal ground zero for the event. The town doctor, Dr. Aris, a calm, steady man who had delivered half the people in Silver Creek, set up a makeshift triage at the community hall. People were scared. An elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, had woken up behind the wheel of her Buick, which was now sitting in the middle of the high school football field's 50-yard line. She had no memory of getting in the car, let alone driving it there. A young couple woke up to the smell of smoke. The pot of chili they'd left on low simmer had burned dry, filling their house with acrid fumes. Miraculously, there were no major fires, no fatal car crashes. A few fender benders, cars that had gently rolled into ditches or against fences, as if the drivers had simply lifted their feet from the pedals as they lost consciousness. It was as if the entire town had been put into a gentle but absolute state of suspended animation. The strangest element, the one that people were hesitant to talk about at first, was the dream. It wasn't a dream in the conventional sense. There were no narratives, no characters. Everyone who could recall anything described the same thing. A feeling of immense, silent pressure like being at the bottom of a deep ocean, and a sound a low, pervasive hum that wasn't heard with the ears but felt in the bones, in the teeth. It was a deep, resonant frequency that seemed to vibrate through every cell of your body. Some people also described a visual component, not an image, but the absence of it. A perfect, featureless black, a void so complete it felt physically present. We were all together in that silent, humming darkness. By noon, the initial shock was giving way to a rising tide of fear and speculation. Was it some kind of environmental toxin? A bizarre, localized atmospheric event? People were locking their doors, afraid it might happen again. Then, around 1:30 p.m., the first outsiders arrived. They weren't from the state police or the National Guard, as we might have expected. They were in a convoy of black, unmarked Ford Expeditions and a large, windowless, white truck. Men in plain, dark blue utility jumpsuits with no identifying insignias began setting up roadblocks on the two highways that led in and out of Silver Creek. They were efficient, silent, and refused to answer any questions. They just held up their hands and pointed back towards town. We were being sealed off. The quarantine was executed with a chilling, silent proficiency that was more terrifying than any shouted order. The men in the blue jumpsuits moved with the disciplined economy of a military unit, but they carried no visible weapons. Their authority was absolute, conveyed through posture and an unnerving lack of communication. They were soon joined by others in full biohazard suits, the kind you see in movies about viral outbreaks. These new arrivals began moving methodically through the town, carrying sophisticated-looking handheld scanners. They didn't knock. They would wait for a door to be opened, or if it wasn't, they would use a tool to bypass the lock with a quiet click. A team of 2 would enter each home. They didn't speak to us directly, at least not at first. They simply moved through the rooms, sweeping their devices over the walls, the furniture, the air itself. The devices emitted a series of soft, melodic chirps, like electronic birdsong. I watched from our living room window as they entered the Hendersons' house across the street. Mr. Henderson, a proud, stubborn man who had once argued with a black bear over a garbage can, tried to block their path. One of the suited figures simply placed a hand on his chest and gently but irresistibly moved him aside. There was no aggression, just an immovable purpose. By late afternoon, a new phase began. Every household received a visitor. This time a man or woman dressed in business casual attire, always accompanied by one of the jumpsuit-clad figures who stood silently by the door. The person who came to our house was a woman who introduced herself as Ms. Evans. She said she was from the Federal Environmental Response Directorate, a name that sounded both plausible and completely fabricated. She explained, in a calm, practiced monotone, that there had been a geological event. A subterranean fissure had released a pocket of a rare, naturally occurring anesthetic gas. "It's a type of argon variant," she said, her eyes never quite meeting ours. "Completely harmless in the long term, but it causes temporary, sudden onset somnolence. The town's unique valley topography trapped the gas, leading to this unusual situation." It almost made sense. It was a neat, tidy explanation that accounted for the universal blackout. But it didn't account for the details. I asked her about the hum, the shared dreamlike state. She gave a small, dismissive smile. "A common neurological side effect. The gas can stimulate the auditory cortex, creating the perception of sound. Mass suggestion can easily account for the similarities in your anecdotal reports." She called them anecdotal reports. My dad asked about Mrs. Gable's car ending up on the football field. Sleepwalking is another known, though rare, side effect. Ms. Evans replied without hesitation. The subconscious mind can be remarkably goal-oriented. For every inconsistency we raised, she had a pre-packaged, scientifically sterile answer. It felt like she was reading from a script, one that had been meticulously prepared to counter any and all questions. She then informed us that, as a precaution, all residents would be required to undergo a brief medical and psychological evaluation over the next few days. It was mandatory. They were setting up a temporary clinic at the high school gymnasium. Before she left, she handed us a pamphlet printed on thick, glossy paper. It was titled, Understanding Natural Geologic Toxin Events. It detailed the effects of various odorless, naturally occurring gases and stressed the importance of cooperating with federal response teams. It was professional, reassuring, and a complete work of fiction. That night, a curfew was imposed. From 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., the hum of a generator from the direction of the high school replaced the usual mountain silence. The black SUVs patrolled the streets, their headlights cutting sharp, sweeping beams through the darkness. The town of Silver Creek, our home, had become a beautifully landscaped prison. We were no longer citizens to be protected. We were specimens to be studied. The feeling of being watched, which had started in the void-like dream, hadn't ended when we woke up. It had just stepped out into the light. The medical and psychological evaluations began the next day. The high school gymnasium, normally home to pep rallies and basketball games, had been transformed into something cold and clinical. The bleachers were pushed back and the floor was covered with a gray, rubberized material. Portable cubicles, the kind used in sterile office environments, were arranged in neat rows. We were processed like cattle. First, a blood draw and a saliva swab, performed by a silent technician in a hazmat suit. Then we were led to one of the cubicles to speak with a psychological assessor. My assessor was a man who looked more like an accountant than a doctor. He had thin, wire-rimmed glasses and a bland, forgettable face. He didn't introduce himself. He just gestured for me to sit and began his questions, his eyes fixed on the laptop in front of him. The questions were bizarre. They started normally enough. How are you feeling? Any lingering headaches or nausea? But quickly veered into unsettling territory. Describe the sound you experienced. Was it a high pitch or a low pitch? Can you replicate it? When you were unconscious, did you perceive any colors? If so, which ones? Did you have any sensation of movement, floating, falling, traveling? Did you feel alone or did you have a sense of other presences? He was intensely interested in the dream. He had me try to hum the frequency. He typed furiously as I described the feeling of pressure, the absolute blackness. He showed me a color chart and asked me to point to the shade of black that most closely resembled the void. It was an absurd task, but his focus was unwavering. The questions felt less like a medical inquiry and more like data collection, an intelligence debriefing. They weren't trying to help us. They were trying to understand what had happened to us, to quantify the experience. They wanted to know exactly what we had seen and felt inside the abyss. My friends Chloe and Ben went through the same process. We met up later that afternoon, hiding in the thick woods behind my house, a place we knew better than any outsider ever could. Chloe, whose dad was still being debriefed at the fire station, said her assessor pressed her on the feeling of being observed. He asked me if I felt the presence was singular or plural, she whispered, her eyes wide. What kind of doctor asks that? Ben, who was a tech nerd and budding skeptic, had a different takeaway. "It's a psychological operation," he stated, breaking a twig with a sharp snap. "The gas story is a smokescreen. Think about it. A gas that knocks everyone out at the exact same instant? Gas doesn't work that way. It would have to seep in. People closer to the fissure would fall asleep first. It would be a rolling event. This was a switch. On, then off." He was right. The synchronicity was the fatal flaw in their story. We talked about the men in the jumpsuits, the scanners, the eerie efficiency of it all. This wasn't a response team. This was a cleanup crew. They were here to manage the aftermath of something they already understood. I decided to start a journal, writing down everything I saw and heard, every detail of the official story, and every contradiction we found. I kept it hidden under a loose floorboard in my closet. It felt like a small act of rebellion, a way to preserve our version of the truth. The atmosphere in town grew heavier with each passing day. The friendly, open community of Silver Creek was dissolving into a collection of suspicious, frightened individuals. Neighbors who had known each other for decades now averted their eyes. People stopped talking about the event in public. The official narrative was the only one permitted, and the silent presence of the federal teams was a constant reminder of that. Anyone who pushed back too hard, who argued too loudly at the community meetings that Miss Evans occasionally held, seemed to quietly disappear. The Millers, a family who had been vocal about inconsistencies, were escorted from their home one morning. The official word was that they were being relocated to a specialized facility for advanced observation. No one ever saw them again. The fear was a tangible thing, as real as the cold mountain air. We were trapped in a grand experiment, and our memories, our very experiences, were being systematically catalogued, analyzed, and then erased. The quarantine stretched from days into a week, then 2. The official story held firm, reinforced by daily pamphlets and carefully managed information sessions. Miss Evans and her team became the de facto government of Silver Creek. They managed food distribution, medical supplies, and most importantly, the flow of information. The internet was down, blamed on a server cascade failure at the regional hub due to the power surge from the geological event. Cell service was spotty to non-existent. We were in a bubble, completely cut off from the outside world, with only their narrative to breathe. But beneath the surface of coerced compliance, a quiet resistance was taking root. My small circle, me, Chloe, and Ben, became a clandestine cell of teenage investigators. We used our deep knowledge of the town's geography to our advantage. We knew the old mining trails that crisscrossed the mountains, the forgotten storm drains, the back alleys that didn't appear on any official map. We met in secret, comparing notes from our journals, piecing together the puzzle. Ben was our technical expert. He had managed to keep a small, battery-powered shortwave radio hidden. At night, he'd climb onto his roof, hoping to catch a stray signal from beyond the valley. Most of it was static, but occasionally he'd pick up snippets of news from Denver or Grand Junction. There was no mention of Silver Creek, no reports of a gas leak, no quarantined town. As far as the rest of the world was concerned, we had ceased to exist. Our biggest breakthrough came from Chloe. Her father, the volunteer firefighter, had finally been cleared from his extended debriefing. He came home a changed man, quieter, more subdued, his eyes holding a haunted look. He refused to talk about what happened at the station, but one evening, while he thought he was alone, Chloe saw him burning his old uniform in the backyard barbecue. Later, she managed to salvage a small, partially melted piece of metal from the ashes. It was a lapel pin, one he never wore. It wasn't a fire department insignia. It was a circle with a stylized bird of prey in the center, its wings spread over a downward-pointing triangle. Below it were two words, barely legible from the heat damage: Project Nightjar. A name. We finally had a name for them, something other than the men in jumpsuits. It felt like a major victory. Ben, armed with this new term, began a new line of inquiry. He couldn't search the internet, but he had a cache of old computer magazines and tech journals from the 90s. He started looking for any mention of government projects, black budget research, or anything related to Nightjar. Meanwhile, I focused on collecting physical evidence. The day after the event, I had noticed a fine, almost invisible layer of dust on the windowsills and the hood of my dad's car. It was dark gray and slightly magnetic. I'd scraped a small sample into a film canister. On a hunch, Ben borrowed a Geiger counter from the high school science lab before it was packed up by the feds. In the secrecy of his garage, we tested my sample. The device, normally silent, began to click. It wasn't a screaming alarm, but there was a definite low-level radioactive signature, slightly above normal background radiation. It wasn't a gas. A gas wouldn't leave a radioactive metallic residue. The official story was not just a lie. It was a carefully constructed fiction designed to hide a technological event. The pieces were starting to fit together. A sudden, synchronized event. A specific time. A shared sensory experience of a low-frequency hum. A radioactive fallout. And a clandestine organization called Project Nightjar sent in to contain and study the results. We weren't victims of a natural disaster. We were lab rats in an unauthorized field test. This realization was both terrifying and empowering. Our fear began to morph into a cold, determined anger. They had violated our homes, our bodies, our minds. They were trying to steal our reality. We couldn't let them. Our small investigation was no longer about simple curiosity. It had become a mission to find out the truth and, somehow, to make it known. The pressure from Project Nightjar intensified as the third week began. They had moved from data collection to active suppression. The relocations became more frequent. It wasn't just vocal dissenters anymore. Old Mr. Abernathy, the town librarian and local historian, was taken away. His crime, we later pieced together, was trying to access the library's archived newspaper records from the past 50 years, looking for precedents. They took his computers, his files, and him. The message was clear: do not dig. The psychological assessors began conducting follow-up interviews. My second meeting with the bland-faced man was different. The questions were sharper, more accusatory. Some of your neighbors' recollections of the sound differ from yours, Leo. Why do you think that is? You've been spending a lot of time in the woods. Is there something out there you're looking for? Your friend, Benjamin, has an interest in radio electronics, doesn't he? They knew. They weren't all seeing, but their surveillance was extensive. They were monitoring conversations, tracking movements. Our little cell was in danger. We had to be more careful. We shifted our meeting spot to the abandoned silver mine entrance high up on Shadow Mountain, a place so dangerous and unstable that even we had rarely dared to go there as kids. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet rock and decay. It was there, by the light of a single lantern, that we laid out our findings. Ben had found something. A single cryptic reference in a 1997 issue of a niche electronics journal. It was an article about the theoretical applications of extremely low-frequency, ELF waves in non-lethal weaponry. The author speculated that a specific resonant frequency, if broadcast over a targeted area with enough power, could potentially disrupt the electrical signals in the human brain, specifically the thalamus, the part responsible for regulating consciousness and sleep. It could, in theory, induce a temporary coma-like state. The article dismissed it as science fiction, requiring an impossible amount of focused energy. But tucked away in the author's footnotes was a thank you to a research grant from the Avian Dynamics Institute, a name so bland it was clearly a front. And the project code he cited for his research? NJR7. Nightjar. We stared at the magazine, the old yellowed paper looking like a sacred text. This was it. This was the weapon. The hum we all felt wasn't a side effect. It was the mechanism of action. The 3:17 a.m. event wasn't an accident. It was a test, a live fire exercise on a civilian population. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying speed. The metallic dust, probably a conductive agent dispersed into the atmosphere to help the ELF wave propagate more effectively through the valley. The low-level radiation, a byproduct of the immense power source required for such a broadcast. The black void and sense of pressure. The brain's response to having its core functions temporarily shut down by an external force. We were sitting on a truth so explosive it could end careers, topple government agencies. It was also a truth that could get us killed. Our mission changed. It was no longer enough to know the truth. We had to preserve it and get it out. We were kids, armed with a magazine article, a radioactive dust sample, and a terrifying story. Against us was a shadowy, well-funded government project with unlimited resources and a demonstrated willingness to make people disappear. The paranoia became a constant companion. Every passing SUV on the street made my heart pound. Every polite nod from one of the federal personnel felt like a threat. They had put us all to sleep once. We knew, with a certainty that chilled us to the bone, that they were capable of doing it again. This time, permanently. The game had changed. We weren't just investigating a mystery anymore. We were planning an escape. The plan was desperate, born from a mix of teenage bravado and genuine fear. We couldn't stay in Silver Creek. The walls were closing in. Our only hope was to get past the quarantine, reach a major city like Denver, and find a journalist or a lawyer, someone who couldn't be easily relocated, and give them everything we had. My journal, the dust sample, the magazine article, and our testimony. Ben was the key. His family had a cabin deep in the Roosevelt National Forest, about 20 miles north of town, well outside the quarantine zone. The problem was getting there. The roadblocks on the main highways were impenetrable. But we had an advantage. We were locals. We knew the terrain. There was an old, decommissioned Forest Service road, barely more than a dirt track, that snaked its way up and over the western ridge. It was treacherous and likely blocked by fallen trees, but it wasn't patrolled. Our escape vehicle would be my dad's old 1988 Toyota pickup. It was a rust bucket, but its four-wheel drive was solid, and it was tough enough to handle the rough terrain. The challenge was getting fuel and supplies without raising suspicion. We spent 3 days siphoning gasoline a little at a time from neighbors' cars and our own, using a length of garden hose. We collected it in old milk jugs, hiding them in the mine entrance. We gathered supplies, non-perishable food from our pantries, warm clothes, blankets, flashlights, and a box of waterproof matches. Every action was cloaked in secrecy, every trip to the mine fraught with the risk of being seen. The night we chose was moonless and cold. A storm was predicted to roll in after midnight, which would help cover our tracks. The three of us met at the mine entrance for the last time. The air was electric with tension. "Once we go, there's no coming back," Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper. We all knew it. We were abandoning our families, our homes, everything we'd ever known. But the alternative, to stay and be silenced, to have our minds and memories slowly overwritten by the official lie, was unthinkable. We left notes for our parents, vague, loving goodbyes, saying we were going camping and would be back in a few days. It was a weak lie, but it was the best we could do to give them plausible deniability. We hoped it would protect them. The first part of the plan was the riskiest. We had to get the truck from my house, loaded with the fuel and supplies, to the trailhead of the Forest Service Road, a 3-mile drive through the still-patrolled town. We waited until 2 a.m. when the patrols were least frequent. Ben, being the smallest, crawled under the truck and disconnected the brake lights to avoid drawing attention. I took the wheel, my hands slick with sweat. Chloe sat in the passenger seat watching the mirrors, her face pale in the dim light from the dashboard. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Driving through the sleeping streets of my own hometown felt like a scene from a spy movie. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low rumble of the Toyota's engine. We passed a black SUV parked at an intersection, its occupants invisible behind the tinted windows. I held my breath, expecting flashing lights, the blare of a siren, but it remained still. They weren't looking for a quiet old pickup. They were looking for dissenters, not escapees. We reached the trailhead, a small, unmarked dirt pull-off without incident. From here on, it was a battle against nature, not Project Nightjar. The road was worse than we'd imagined. It was a scar of rock and mud, overgrown with brush. I engaged the four-wheel drive, and we lurched forward into the oppressive darkness of the forest. The branches of pine and aspen scraped against the sides of the truck, a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. Twice, we had to get out and use a small handsaw to clear fallen logs from our path. The work was exhausting, our breath pluming in the cold air. After an hour of brutal, bone-jarring progress, we reached the summit of the ridge. From there, we could look back down at Silver Creek. It was nestled in the valley below, a scattering of lights under a blanket of generator-powered haze. It looked peaceful, almost idyllic. But we knew it was a prison, a laboratory, a tomb for the truth. As we started our descent down the other side, the first flakes of snow began to fall, just as predicted. They swirled in our headlights, a curtain of white closing behind us, erasing our tracks, severing our last connection to the town where everyone fell asleep. The journey to Ben's family cabin was a grueling 24-hour ordeal. The old Forest Service road on the other side of the ridge was even more dilapidated. We faced 2 washouts where we had to physically rebuild sections of the road with rocks and logs just to get the truck across. The storm intensified, blanketing the landscape in a thick layer of snow that both hid us and threatened to trap us. The Toyota, bless its rusty soul, performed heroically. But by the time we finally saw the dark shape of the cabin through the swirling snow, we were running on fumes, both literally and figuratively. The cabin was our sanctuary. It was rustic and cold, but it was safe. It had a well-stocked pantry, a wood-burning stove, and most importantly, no connection to the Silver Creek power grid or communication lines. For the first time in weeks, we felt like we could breathe. We spent the first few days just recovering, sleeping in shifts, keeping the fire going. The sense of being constantly watched slowly began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of isolation. We were ghosts, fugitives from a town that no longer officially existed. After a week when the storm had passed, Ben and I made the risky trip to the nearest small town, a place called Oakhaven, about 40 miles away. We sold the Toyota's spare tire for gas money. In the Oakhaven Public Library, we finally connected to the internet. The silence about Silver Creek was deafening. We searched news archives, government websites, social media. Nothing. It was as if a town of 200 people had simply vanished from the map. Ben, using his technical skills, dug deeper. He found that the town's official website had been taken down. Census records for Silver Creek returned an error. It was a digital erasure, systematic and thorough. The only mentions we could find were on a few obscure conspiracy theory forums, where anonymous users posted garbled rumors about a quarantined town in the Rockies. They were dismissed as fiction. We had the evidence, but who would believe us? We were 3 teenagers with a wild story. The Project Nightjar evidence was circumstantial. My journal was just my word. The dust sample could be explained away. We realized with a sinking feeling that storming into a newspaper office would likely get us sent to a psychiatric ward, or worse, back into the hands of Miss Evans and her associates. Our strategy had to be smarter. We decided to lay low. We used the small amount of cash we had to buy new SIM cards and a cheap burner phone. We created new email addresses. We became phantoms. From the relative safety of the cabin, we began our new mission, a slow, patient dissemination of the truth. We couldn't dump the whole story at once. It was too incredible. Instead, we started small. We broke the story down into component parts and began leaking them anonymously to those fringe conspiracy forums. We posted about the shared dream, the low-frequency hum. We uploaded a digitized version of the ELF weapon article. We posted a chemical analysis of the metallic dust, which Ben faked using data from a university website to make it look official. We never mentioned Silver Creek by name, only referring to it as an isolated mountain community. We were planting seeds, hoping one of them would take root in fertile ground. We created a narrative bit by bit, building a foundation of evidence in the dark corners of the internet. It was a frustrating, slow process. Most of our posts were ignored or ridiculed, but a few people started connecting the dots. They referenced our different posts, piecing together the narrative we were carefully constructing. They started calling it the Whispering Valley Incident. It wasn't the mainstream exposé we had dreamed of, but it was a start. It was our truth, surviving in the digital wilderness. We knew Project Nightjar would be monitoring the internet. It was a race. We had to build enough of a public record of the story before they found us. The paranoia returned, a constant low-level hum in the back of our minds, a chilling echo of the night that had changed everything. The next few years were a blur of paranoia and transient living. We stayed at the cabin for as long as we could, nearly 6 months, until our supplies and money ran out. From there, we drifted. We took cash jobs, washing dishes, stocking shelves, landscaping, anything that didn't require a social security number. We moved from one small, forgettable town to another across the western United States, never staying in one place for more than a few months. We adopted new names, new backstories. I became Leo, a kid from nowhere in particular. Chloe became Mia. Ben became Sam. The names felt foreign, costumes we wore to survive. Our real selves, the kids from Silver Creek, were buried deep. We rarely spoke of our families. The pain and guilt were too great. We had to believe that our disappearance had protected them, that our silence was their shield. Occasionally, Ben would use a secure connection at a university library to try and find them. He found that my parents had moved a year after the incident. Their house was sold to a corporation with a generic name. There was no forwarding address. It was the same for Chloe's family. They had been scattered, their ties to that place and each other deliberately severed by the same invisible hand that had managed the quarantine. The digital trail we had so carefully laid out, the Whispering Valley incident, grew into a minor legend in online circles. It became a piece of modern folklore, a creepypasta shared on late-night forums. It was both a success and a failure. The story survived, but it was treated as fiction. No serious journalist ever investigated it. No official inquiry was ever launched. Project Nightjar had won. They had successfully contained the truth by allowing it to become an unbelievable fantasy. They had inoculated the world against our reality by turning it into a ghost story. We saw the long-term effects of the experiment in ourselves. We all suffered from chronic insomnia, a cruel irony. Sleep was no longer a refuge, but a source of anxiety. We would jolt awake at the slightest sound, our hearts pounding. We all had the same faint, persistent tinnitus, a low hum that no one else could hear, a permanent echo of 3:17 a.m. Chloe developed a severe aversion to enclosed spaces. Ben became obsessed with digital security, layering his life with encryption and firewalls, a man perpetually hiding from ghosts in the machine. I was left with a compulsion to document, to write, to bear witness, even if only to myself. The dust sample, our single most important piece of physical evidence, was lost. We had it hidden in a lead-lined box, but during a hasty move from a motel in Oregon, the bag containing it was lost or stolen. With it went our only tangible link to the scientific reality of what had happened. We were left with only the story. After 5 years on the run, our small group fractured. The constant stress and fear had worn us down. Chloe, now Mia, wanted a chance at a normal life. She met someone, fell in love, and decided to take the risk of putting down roots. She cut ties with us, erasing her past for a second time, hoping to build a future. I don't blame her. Ben or Sam went in the opposite direction. He delved deeper into the world of hacking and digital activism, becoming a true phantom, fighting his war against institutional secrecy from the shadows. I haven't heard from him in 3 years. I hope he's safe. That left me, Leo, the chronicler. I settled in a city large enough to be anonymous. I found a job, a small apartment. I tried to build a life, but I could never escape the memory of Silver Creek. I could never forget the feeling of that silent, humming darkness. I'm writing this now because I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of the truth being a ghost story. The people who did this to us, the architects of Project Nightjar, are still out there. They are older now, perhaps retired, but they are not gone. The technology they tested on us is undoubtedly far more advanced now. I don't know what their ultimate goal was. Mass control, a non-lethal weapon for the battlefield, something else entirely. But I know what they did. They stole a night from 200 people. They stole a town from the map. They stole our lives, our names, our pasts. They turned us into living ghosts. This account is all I have left. It's my final act of defiance. They can erase records, relocate families, and dismiss the truth as fiction, but they cannot erase my memory. I was there. We were all there.